Welcome. You're listening to Latin Waves with your hosts, Sylvia and Stuart Richardson. Latin Waves is more than just hot rhythms. This is a show about community, about creating a culture that is inclusive and based on fairness. Because everyone deserves dignity, respect, and has something to contribute. A new world is possible, and it all starts with us.
It's a pleasure to have Arnold August online. He's a Montreal-based author of 3 books on the U.S., Cuba, and Latin America. As a journalist, he appears regularly on teleSur and Press TV, commenting on international geopolitical issues, and as a contributing editor to the Canada Files, and his articles are published worldwide in English, French, and Spanish. Thanks for joining us, Arnold.
Pleasure to be with you once again.
Now, recently on just past January 27th, we commemorated the 78th anniversary of the liberation of the Auschwitz German Nazi concentration camp. Instead of this being a unifying moment for the world, Russia wasn't invited to the ceremony despite its historic role by the Red Army. Can you outline the cost to Russia in regards to the liberation of Auschwitz and how outrageous it is that they were excluded?
Well, I mean, it was really not only an attack against Russia and the former Soviet Union, but it's also an attack, in my view, against, collective thinking, if we may put it that way, all over the world with regards to World War II and the current situation in Europe at this time. Now, we know that the USSR, 78 years ago, they were the ones who broke through and opened the Auschwitz camps and allowed those survivors, which were very few, to be free. I mean, USSR inflicted 80% of German casualties, and they lost 27 million of its own people. So let our listeners take this into account, let that sink in. I've been analyzing this right from the beginning, but specifically with regards to this latest event, the United States, from the beginning, has been attempting, since February 24th, 2022, has been attempting to turn history on its head for its own advantage. Slowly but surely, from February 24th on, I watched very carefully CNN, which is the best way to get an inside view of the thinking of the current administration. And right from the beginning, almost a year ago, they started to portray Russia as an inferior race. I remember very clearly, I'd like to share this with the listeners, that on February 24th, CNN interviewed, as is always their case, a former military attaché from the United States to Moscow. And what did he say upon being questioned? He said, well, I remember when I was in Moscow, I had discussion with other top generals. He's a military man from the U.S. And he basically said, well, we are not like you, that is Russia, we are not like the United States. And of course, what he said, well, it is true. Looking in his eyes, he said, I see they are not the same as us. So that's the first step to a long-term racial slur against Russia, and indirectly, I would say, Stuart, as well, an attack on socialism and communism as it existed in the USS before, even though we all know Russia is not socialist at this time.
It's been about a year now, or close to a year, since this conflict has begun. The U.S. and NATO have managed to corral $100 billion worth of weapons to Ukraine to fight this proxy war with Russia. Despite many domestic issues we seem unable to solve, it seems the sky's the limit when it comes to funding this war. What is your current analysis of the conflict as it stands today?
As it stands today, right now as we speak, we know over the last week, there was a definite spike in propaganda in favor of war against Russia. I mean, I don't know if you saw that, a very interesting clip by the German foreign minister a few days ago, in which she said openly, addressing the European countries, Europe, we have to stick together because we are at war with Russia. So this is the first time a European country has admitted that they are at war with Russia. And then we have other similar statements coming out about the same time. And the point is now that is more openly being said is that this whole thing is against Russia. I would like to add one thing, just to provide more context before we go further into the current details, is that, in my view, this whole war started in 2014 with the overthrow of the democratically elected government in Ukraine, in Kiev. Now, they kept, at that point, they kept on pushing Russia, bringing Ukraine arms, etc., as close as possible to the Russian border. And February 24th, 2022, President Putin said, well, this is enough. He started to carry out the special military operation. Now, mind you, like, why was and is the United States so much in favor of attacking Russia or provoking Russia to get into a war with NATO? I think that the main overall feature comes about as a result of the international situation, the changing geopolitical map of the world. And the United States, in attacking Russia, is also attacking China. Let us make no mistake about it. The United States is against Russia, tries to stabilize it. Why? Because they want to weaken that growing alliance and cooperation between, on the one hand, Russia, and on the other hand, China. So we can say the ultimate goal is not Russia, it is China. In fact, if someone thinks, well, Arnold is crazy, just 2-3 days ago, one of the heads of the military, just 2-3 days ago, he said that we are really preparing for a war against China. This is coming from him. He was a major general in the American Army, a spokesperson for the military. So what he said, it confirms not only myself, but many other analysts have said that it was a first step in trying to contain China.
For sure. I've been listening to a lot of the commentary, and I just recently heard that general talking about China. It's like they want a third world war, and I just want to say that when everybody says the whole world's behind NATO and the United States, well, that whole world doesn't include most of Asia, Africa, and Latin America. The whole world is divided dramatically, and we've talked about the 2014 coup on the show before and how there was a lot of shelling and killing of ethnic Russians in the East, and no NATO nations and no mainstream media seemed to have any bleeding hearts towards the killing that was happening in the East. Now, it seems that NATO and Canada, they're very excited about sending more tanks. There might be jets coming from Poland. Where's the anti-war movement? We could be on the cusp of a world war. I don't see the anti-war movement. Is it because of who's in the White House, or is it party before principles? Like, what's happening to our civil society? Where are the protests that I seen with the Iraq War?
One of your comments at the beginning of your last question is very, very significant. I would like to elaborate very quickly on that. You said most of the world does not agree with the U.S.-NATO narrative. It is very important. For example, on the issue of sanctions against Russia, governments representing countries that compose 88% of the world's population are not into the NATO narrative against Russia. That is very significant. So listeners have to take into mind, whenever the mass media, whether it's CBC or Globe and Mail or elsewhere in the United States, say, well, the international community is doing this. Wait, who is the international community? The international community is United States, Canada, and most countries in Europe. That's it. The rest of the world, close to 90% of the world's population, have not fallen into the trap of the U.S. NATO narrative. This is very significant. So some people from Asia, Africa, and Latin America, if they hear the news from the United States saying the international community, well, the international community completely excludes people of color, other origins, throughout the global south, Asia, Africa, and Latin America. So this is why, and it's not surprising, the United States, in their very confident notion that everyone loves us, cannot even come to grips with this issue that the majority of the countries, especially in the south, do not support what the U.S., NATO, Canada actions and narrative is taking place. And I think as an outcome of that, while the United States tried to smash Russia with sanctions, starting right after February 24, 2022, what happened? It's the opposite happened. The Russian economy is actually booming now. The Russian economy has developed close ties that were building up before February 24, 2022, with China, the most important economic player in the world scale, as well as with Iran, as well as with other countries in the world, including even Saudi Arabia has been developing ties with China, and there's a whole series of international blocs, for example, the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, to which Argentina has applied to join, as well as other countries as well. So while on the one hand you have these BRICS type of coalitions that are growing, on the other side, the United States is having a very difficult time keeping their coalition together in Europe. For example, Hungary is playing a very favorable role. Up to now, they refuse to fully participate in sanctions and the sending of tanks to the Ukrainian arena. And so, United States has lost the battle against Russia. Russia is thriving. Russia has more and more alliances. People, for example, China is developing its influence in Africa, Iran, of course, in Latin America, Russia in Latin America. It's going on all over the place. And what is happening now in Europe, is there going to be a fracture in Europe? Is there going to be an uprising from some countries against the war in Ukraine at this time, as the winter starts to set in, and the lack of affordable gas and other similar needs to keep people warm, to cook, etc., is no longer available as it was before. Now you say, where's the anti-war movement? Well, in Europe, I think it has been developing, in the sense there are we never see that on mainstream media, of course. Okay. Massive demonstrations in France, in other countries in Europe, in the United Kingdom, against their respective governments because of reforms, for example, in France and other aspects of their policy, which directly affects the day-to-day living conditions of the people in these countries. So will these demonstrations pick up even further? For example, I think more demonstrations are being carried out in France against the Macron government, but I think many of the people in countries such as France and in the UK as well, where actions are also taking place, are pretty much very well schooled in international policy to know that the shortages of basic needs in France, in the UK, and other countries in Europe is directly connected to the massive spending and attention that is going on in these European countries in order to support, we have to say, the U.S. warfare in Europe, using Ukraine as a proxy. So, this thing can build up in the coming months, and hopefully it will be. So, with regard, you mentioned the peace movement in Canada and the United States. Well, it also has been developing, but I think not as much as you and I and other like-minded people would suggest. And I think one of the reasons is that, the people in the peace movement, the vast majority, they say they're against NATO aggression, U.S. NATO aggression against Russia. But they also just have to say, they just can't keep their mouths shut, they have to, we are against Russian invasion. And one, some very well-known, almost iconic journalist or anti-war person said, well, what Russia did, it was a crime against humanity on February 24th. And others similar, they have to, finalize with this position against Russia. Now, we all know the United States and Canada and their spy agencies, they know what is happening in the peace movement in Canada and the United States. Do you not think that they noticed that important sections of the left or the anti-war movement in Canada and the United States, that they agree with the U.S. NATO position that the Russian invasion of Ukraine is a crime against humanity? And what does that imply? Well, even if you're a leftist, it implies that Europe and the United States, they have a justifiable position of opposing Russia because, as some in the left say, it carried out aggression against Ukraine, and it was a crime against humanity. I think this is one of the reasons why the peace movement is not as vibrant as we speak today as we would like. I mean, some of the people are saying, well, why is it so? Well, some of them who are asking why is it so, they should look in the mirror. Right. And then when they say Russia carried out a military invasion, an act of war against Ukraine, this helps the United States. They know that even amongst the left, so-called left, even amongst the so-called peace movement, you have people who very well do very good job in echoing the NATO narrative against Russia, but of course, Stuart, giving it a so-called left camouflage, so that it goes across better and helps the overall narrative of the United States and NATO.
For sure, this war has been in preparations for a long time, since 2014. They had the coup government, as you say, and they were provoking. And I always say to people, what would happen if there was a Russia-backed Mexican coup government amassing weapons on the U.S. border and randomly killing U.S. civilians? And I just want to say I feel so terrible that the people of Ukraine are being used in the middle between Russia and NATO, and it seems like NATO wants to fight to the last Ukrainian, and there's so much suffering going on. I believe that if Russia had security guarantees in the East and Ukraine would stay out of NATO, this thing could be solved. But it looks like they're going to push this as long as they can, and the sensible voices of peace are getting pushed to the back burner. What are your thoughts moving forward in regards to how this is affecting, you kind of touched on it, but domestic policies? I mean, if you look around our cities, if you look at inflation in Canada, we have like 6 million people a month using food banks. We have tent cities. This is literally stealing from the taxpayer to fund war. So could you touch again a little more on the aspect of how this money is being misappropriated?
Well, I mean, another very important video surfaced just a few days ago. Last week was, for people who do the research on this subject, it was really a great week. Like Zelensky went on TV a few days ago, and he said openly, this is to an audience, plugged in through Zoom to an American audience. You know what Zelensky said? It's important to send armaments to Ukraine, and these armaments are also a godsend, something very important for the armaments industry. So you have it right there in a nutshell. Basically, there's been a lot of talk over the years, and some people like to quote Eisenhower when he said the United States is based on a military-industrial complex. But I don't think, since World War II, we have been gifted with a very obvious role of the military-industrial complex, whereas this money is, taxpayers' money, whether it's from Canada or United States or the UK, they just go right into the military-industrial complex, whose profits, of course, have been soaring, increasing massively over the last few months. So that is really about, and in that, of course, to make sure that this money keeps on going from the taxpayer's pocket to the armaments industry, is to provide a basic lie that Ukraine is winning and it's possible for Ukraine to win. Sorry, guys, but Ukraine has already lost. They had 30, 40 countries, from Europe, Canada, etc., against Russia. But they still have not been able to defeat Russia. On the contrary, Russia, I think, has been keeping its word to not attack civilian areas as much as possible, but rather to denazify Ukraine, and this way also attempt to improve the situation so that a solution can be reached. And I think, let us go back a few months. There was a virtual possible negotiations taking place between Ukraine and Russia a few months ago. But who showed up in Kiev in Ukraine? It was Boris Johnson from England, who went there and specifically told, and this is the information that came out, specifically told Zelensky, don't sign any agreement. You have to write to the last Ukrainian. So the United States, from the beginning, they did not want negotiation. They do not, and in the future, they will not accept negotiation unless they are in a very difficult situation, which may take place. And Ukraine will have to capitulate in the face of Russia. President Putin, the Russian military, Russian leadership, and Russia, it is not communist, it's not socialist, but it's a peculiar feature of Russia today that only recently used to be the USSR, the banner of socialism, struggle against U.S. imperialism, against colonialism. So that's not too long ago. And the people in Russia, and even Putin, who has, I think his father was killed in the Second World War against Germany, this is part of the psyche of current Russia. And I would, say that within Russia, there is increasing nostalgic attitude to going back to the USSR style of socialism and a very strong anti-imperialism. So the United States, of course, in their very narrow U.S.-centered notion that Russia can do no good, Russia are barbarians. They try to wipe out everything with regards to the history of Russia. And we saw in Auschwitz, you just mentioned, who liberated Auschwitz? Who killed the Nazis? It was Russia. Right. And they're doing this again now. And, I think that how the scenario in the future is really hard to say. But one thing for sure, Ukraine cannot win the war. Will there be resistance? There is some resistance in Ukraine against forced conscription. Many things are taking place in Ukraine at this time. And in the coming months, we can see not only, perhaps, I hope so, as I guess you also hope, and all our listeners, that in Europe there'll be a real uprising against the war. I mean, it's really disgusting. Europe has such a long history of progress, struggle in support of socialism. For example, in France, the French Revolution, and then the Paris Commune, and the 1960s against capitalism and support of a new France. The same thing, of course, even in Germany and the United Kingdom. It is really a shame that these countries that have a long tradition, of course, much of it is very negative. They were also savage colonialists against the people of Asia, Africa, and Latin America, but they also have this tradition of being on the progressive side of history. For example, the French Revolution, the Paris Commune, May 1968. Will this come up again in the coming months, so that Europe finally will say, hey, we do not want to be the flunkies. We do not want to be the lackeys of U.S. imperialism. We want to have our own evaluation of the situation and the capacity, the ability, which Europe is capable of doing, to have our own independent policy with regards to Ukraine. Now, if this happens, this could be another factor that will slow down any attempts by the United States and its allies to keep fueling the whole conflict by sending in more armaments.
No, recently the U.S. Diplomat, they admitted to blowing up Nord Stream pipeline, which brought cheap energy to Europe. And now Europe is dependent on imported fracked gasoline to Europe, which is much more expensive. So Europeans are really paying a price for this war. People across the United States are dealing with crushing inflation, and same in here in Canada. Yet, seems the sky's the limit for this conflict and how much the West and the U.S. is willing to spend to weaken Russia. And the news, like you just kind of alluded to it, this is not Afghanistan. They were chased out of Afghanistan in 20 years. This is a nuclear power with multiple thousands of warheads and large military. This is not a small country. And the idea that we're going to push back Russia and get them to surrender is ludicrous. So there must be a negotiated peace. There must be cooler heads prevail. And I think one way that people can progress and learn more is from reading some of your articles and getting the right information. So if you can point to some resources that people can find for themselves.
Well, if you go to my website, it's www.arnoldaugust.com. There you have access to my most recent articles from various sources in English and other languages.
And my hope is that cooler heads will prevail. I know I speak to a lot of people around, and I haven't met anyone that is really excited about going into a decades of long struggle with Russia, and they want this to come to an end. So our leaders have led us astray, and I thank you for your time today, and we'll keep in touch.
Thank you very much. I very much appreciated the conversation and your very astute questions.
Thank you for listening to Latin Waves. Latin Waves is an independently produced syndicated radio program made available for free to campus and community radios, and also to the world at latinwavesmedia.com. Please visit the website to hear previous shows, hear about upcoming events, and consider becoming a member for as little as $1 per month.